continue Vilnius Symposium, and panel number 2 is dedicated to Vilnius as a place of arts, faith, and culture. And as you have already noticed, the format of this symposium brings us to an ambition to address Vilnius in all of the different facets that are naturally interdisciplinary, but even more so to make different voices heard. And I think we have witnessed a brilliant conversation on the Vilnius as a place of history in panel number 1. And now we'll try to get our focus closer on the matters of culture and faith that are deeply intertwined in the whole fabric of Vilnius, both as a place, but also as an idea. So for that purpose, we have an outstanding panel here that I'm truly honored to moderate today. Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University, Professor Irena Vaishulaita of Vilnius University, Dr. Jonathan Brandt of YIVO, and Dr. Jūratė Čerškutė of the Lithuanian Institute of Folklore and Literature. And we'll proceed in the following sequence as the panelists sit just nearby me. And without any further ado, we'll get started. And I think I'll start with someone who was just a few months ago still my boss here at Yale, Professor Snyder, who I was privileged to work for as a teaching assistant. And I'll perhaps try to link to that connection because being here at Yale a year ago, something truly remarkable happened. For the first time in US academia, perhaps the most comprehensive class on the history of Ukraine was actually delivered here by Professor Snyder, looking back to the very origins of the history of modern-day Ukraine, dating back to ancient Greeks and all the way through till nowadays. Nothing comparable of this scope is available at any other school in the US. If you haven't noticed that class, it's available on YouTube, but it's not a promo or advertisement for a class. It actually is a lead to talking about one more nation that so far I don't think we have mentioned in this room, particularly about Ukrainians and Ukrainian relationship with Vilnius. So far we talked about Belarusians, we talked about Poles, Lithuanians, of course, Jews, somewhat Russians, but what about Ukraine, Ukrainians, and Vilnius? And therefore, Professor, I'm very curious to ask your opinion about this sort of paradox. On one hand, we have modern-day Ukraine that's been a part of Grand Duchy of Lithuania, or substantial part of modern-day Ukraine, being a part of Grand Duchy of Lithuania for over 2 centuries, right? From early 14th century till the Union of Lublin, in fact. Yet Ukrainians are left very often aside when we discuss Vilnius, when we discuss what shapes Vilnius, what makes the Vilnius identity so unique. Why is it so that Ukrainians are often left aside when the conversation goes on about Vilnius?
So first of all, it's very nice to see everyone here. It's a beautiful day outside, so there will be many other temptations and many other things to do. Secondly, I want to thank Maximus for taking the trouble to come back to Yale and help to organize this event. There are many Yale students who think of being at Yale as something from which they take, and Maximus was a student who, while he was here, gave and gave and gave and gave and made this place much better by his presence. So thank you, Maximus, for this last bit of work that you are doing here in this place and also for this place. I'm also very glad to be included because I can't, compared to almost everyone here, I can't claim to be an expert on things Vilnian, but Maximus has given us a very general question, and I do have some general thoughts. It's interesting that you mentioned the class because in that Making of Modern Ukraine class, I had 3 TFs, and one was Polish, one was Ukrainian, one was Lithuanian, and which was remarkable good luck, I have to say. It doesn't always happen like that. In fact, it never really happens like that. And it was interesting to see how naturally they joked about this, of course, and they spoke in their overlapping languages to each other, and they had inside jokes. But it was interesting to see how well that worked together. And what I want to suggest in my answer is that you can see both the sources and the limits of the Ukrainian-Lithuanian connection when you look hard at Poland. But let me wind back before I come to my conclusion. So the broad framework for my answer, and I really hope this isn't something that people were saying already in the first session, and I'm sorry I missed it. I had to teach. The Lithuania tends to get, and Vilnius tends to get a little lost in the standard way that we look at Europe from the late 20th century onward, which is East and West, right? People are very much stuck in this framework of East and West, where West is where the action is, West is where things happen, and if you're in the East, therefore you must want to be in the West. And it's almost as if the definition of the East is that you want to be in the West, right? Western Europe and Europe are more or less the same thing. And in that game, if you're in the East, what you do is you try to show how really we're not so different. Really, we had all the things that you had. Maybe we had all the things that you had, but they were better or tastier, or they began with Sanskrit, or whatever it might be. It's a struggle to show that like there isn't really a difference between East and West. And what I want to suggest is something that I think probably we all know at some level, which is that this way of seeing history as East and West is a very, very recent and superficial phenomenon. We're all trapped in it, and we're not going to get out of it tomorrow or just because I make a pretty speech. But it is something which is very recent, and therefore it can distract us when we try to understand something like the question which Maximus posed about Vilnius and Kiev. Let's call it like that. In this history, in this region with which we're concerned, the much more important axis for almost all of the history, and by almost all the history, I mean, and now I will bore the students who actually are in my seminar, which I see two. Thank you very much for being here. The much more important axis going all the way back to the beginning, like literally all the way back to the first sources, to the ancient Greek sources about the Black Sea, is north-south. North-south is much more important. The Baltic Sea to the Black Sea is much, much more important. It's more important to the Greeks. It's more important to the Scythians. It's more important to the Varangians who established Kiev. And of course, it's that north-south axis along which the Grand Duchy of Lithuania establishes its relationship with Kiev. It's precisely because the Grand Duchy is threatened from the west by the Teutonic Knights, by the Knights of the Sword, that it pushes south and envelops all of this territory of Rus, Belarus, and what's now northern, let's call it this, northern Ukraine. And so what the Grand Duchy of Lithuania is doing is moving to the south. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania becomes the largest country in Europe by moving south, and it's moving south in a perfectly sensible way along rivers, right? When you get as far as Kiev, that means you've gone so far along the Dnipro, right? That's an axis which really matters in history. So, and when Vilnius, when the Grand Duchy does that, it opens up something very interesting from the point of view of Kiev. So again, if you're Kiev, you're also trapped, just like Vilnius, you're trapped in this east-west business, right? And we see that with great intensity now, and sometimes with great sadness during the war, where Ukrainians are forced into this position where they have to show like we're actually more European than you, or it's like we're more to the west than you, and we have all the stuff that you have, and there are true things that are said, but often that misses the essence of the matter, I think, which is the essence being that there are actually elements in Ukrainian history which one doesn't have in Western Europe, and which make for a much more interesting story, in fact. But from the point of view of Kiev, what happens is that yes, there's a threat from the east. The Mongols, who were reestablishing their trade routes in the 1230s and 40s, destroy what's left of Kiev and Rus. And then, so from the point of view of Kiev and Rus, what is Vilnius? Vilnius is the north, and what remains of Kiev and Rus at this time, right? What's left of Kiev and Rus is the civilizational package, the thing which made Kiev and Rus a very impressive medieval state, namely the laws and the language. And the language was, of course, a Slavic language, Old Church Slavonic, some vernacular thrown in, and you get this thing which scholars like to call Chancellery Slavonic, and that goes to the north, right? So Kiev, the civilization of Kiev, survives because of the way that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania governs. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, sure, it kills some people along the way, but in general, it respects the local warlords, and it respects the local people who will become magnates, and it respects local customs, and there's lots of intermarriage. And it, rather than forcing its own, pagan Baltic culture on anyone, it actually absorbs the culture of Kiev, which gives the Grand Duchy, which is a kind of, if you want, Europeanization of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania before it's Christianized, right? Or around the same time that it's Christianized, or simultaneous with Christianization. But for what goes from south to north, then, from Kiev to Vilnius, is a non-Polish version of Europe, right? This is very important. It's a non-Polish version of Europe. No, I mean, I'm not just anxious about Poland. Yeah. I'm not just, no, it's not just the elections have me anxious. It's like there's an important point here, because eventually Ukrainian and Polish history are very much entangled, but not yet, right? Not yet. So at around the moment when the Lithuanian Grand Duke is marrying the Polish king, who happens to be a teenage girl, at around that time, Lithuania is undertaking this other, if you want, Europeanization by way of Kiev, which is based in Slavonic, which is based in the law codes of Rus. And that non-Polish, if you want, Europe, or that non-Polish civilizational package survives alongside the Polish package. And so, like, the easy answer to your question, why don't we think of Ukraine, is that during that period that you're talking about, the late 14th century to the late 16th century. And now here's where I get in trouble with the Ukrainians. There isn't a Ukraine then, right? There is a Rus, right? There's a Rus or a post-Rus, right? But there isn't a Ukraine. So long as that north-south current is running from Kiev to Vilnius, what we don't have is Ukraine. What we have is Rus inside Lithuania, right? Rus, which is governed from Vilnius. And that's the package that you have until the Union of Lublin. And so that's very, very important. But it breaks at the moment, at least in my interpretation, it breaks at the moment that we actually have something called Ukraine. So when do we have something called Ukraine? Maximus has already given you the answer. It has to do with the Union of Lublin. What the Union of Lublin does. So if you're Polish or maybe even Lithuanian, and you think of the Union of Lublin, it's a unification, it's a legalization, it's a constitutionalization, it's a wonderful pre-modern republic. Look at all those people who can vote and so on. And I give you all of that. And I'm happy to teach it that way too. But what the Union of Lublin also does is that it changes the territorial configuration inside the boundaries of Poland, Lithuania, such that 3 of the voivodstva, which are now Ukrainian, 3 of the voivodstva go from the Lithuanian Grand Duchy to the Polish Crown lands. And from my point of view, that's when you get Ukraine. Like that's when you have this boundary, this east-west boundary, new boundary, which hadn't existed before, entirely political boundary, not a natural boundary at all, inside the old lands of Rus, which separates, roughly speaking, what's now Belarus from what's now Ukraine, right? And it's from that point forward, 1569, that the northern part of this Rus, what we now call Belarus, is still part of the historical Grand Duchy, but the southern part of Old Rus is not. It's not part of the Grand Duchy, it's part of Poland. And then we get the Polish dimension, right? Hard and fast. We get the Polish dimension in this incredibly thick, hard, fast version with Polish language Renaissance, Polish language Reformation, Polish Counter-Reformation, Polish Jesuits, Polish printing presses, remarkable Polish language, all like coming into Kiev at hyper speed, right? And this ancient Kievan civilization, which had prospered in Vilnius in some version for a couple of centuries, is now suddenly faced with this incredible challenge across all of these dimensions. And then add to that Polish landowning practices and Polish estates, right, and serfdom. Add to all of that, and you have this incredible challenge to Kiev, which comes from Poland, and so it comes from Warsaw, which is just barely the capital, but it comes from Warsaw. So this is the difference between, so I said, like, the sources and the limits, right? So the moment that you have the confrontation with Poland, I think from that moment, it makes sense to start talking about Ukraine. And in fact, the Cossacks do start talking about Ukraine in the 17th century. But for me, the reason why it makes sense is because now you have this boundary. So Rus is broken in two, and it's that breaking of Rus in two which makes it possible for us to talk about Ukraine. But because we talk about Ukraine from that moment onward, we tend not to see those earlier 2 centuries and how important they were.
All right, then. Having said that, I assume still those fragments of ancient Kievan civilizations, then in the form of Greek Catholicism, right? The order of Basilians, for example, they remain in Vilnius, right? And in that regard, Vilnius still provides them a shelter. So we can find still fragment, just trying to counter my former boss in that sense. So still, I was partially right, but of course, he's right there in providing this answer. But no, clearly, that is a very fair point, Professor. And then jumping immediately from this experience of Vilnius as a political capital, as a very welcoming environment for different confessional practices, different cultural orientations, we suddenly look further in the history of Vilnius, and we find it also as a place of terrible atrocities and crimes of totalitarian regimes. And thinking about Vilnius on one end of the spectrum, we think about this immense tolerance and ability for different confessions to coexist, and yet at the same time, in a very short period of time, being the place of most horrific tragedies of Holocaust in particular, all in the same spot. What does that coexistence of two very extreme experiences that have shaped the world in one another way tell us in a broader perspective? And Vilnius is at the forefront of that, both of the tolerance, but also of the totalitarian experiences. How does Vilnius play into that?
So I'm hoping that Maximus's questions to the rest of you are remotely as challenging as this. And yes, actually, I'm sure I'm going to need some relief. I mean, so now I have to talk about East and West a little bit before I can even answer that, because one of the things which is characteristic of the Polish-Lithuanian, the Polish-Lithuanian Rusian or Polish-Lithuanian Ruthenian or Polish-Lithuanian Ukrainian world is, as you say, this extraordinary variety. And it's it's the world homeland of the Jews, but also precisely along that north-south corridor, it's also the homeland of quite a few Muslims. I mean, as everyone who studied anything like this knows, on that corridor, because the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was engaged with the Crimean Khanate for those 2 centuries that we're talking about, that was the border, right? Like once you absorb Rus, then your neighbor is the Crimean Khanate. And because there's regular campaigning, there were also lots of prisoners of war and lots of resettlement, and Crimean Tatars then become an integral part of Lithuanian civilization. And so it's not just that there are uniates, as you say very properly, that's very important, and Jews and Karaites and all sorts of people in Vilnius, but also Crimean Tatars until quite late in the day. And in fact, there still, of course, are some. So, but this is what's special about, as I see it, our part of the world. So there are many different ways to say what's different about this part of the world, and I think that the complexity of the state building at the beginning is interesting, whether it's the state building around Kiev or the state building around Vilnius. The complexity of it is incredibly interesting, and the sustenance of diversity over time is very interesting. So I just have to build in this contrast before I start talking about the answer to your question. West European societies have like to think of themselves as having prestige as tolerant, but that's largely because a lot of the purification was carried out much earlier on. So the Jews are expelled, just to take the Jewish example, the Jews are expelled from West European societies very early on. And so therefore, if you get to the 20th century and there's a Holocaust, no matter what happens, I mean, just purely mathematically, that's going to be a different kind of event in Eastern Europe than it's going to be in Western Europe, because in the West European states expelled their Jews long before. And so you simply don't have the kinds of numbers, right? I mean, the Holocaust is associated with Germany, but there just actually weren't that many Jews in Germany to start out with. There were about as many as there were in Łódź or Warsaw, and in France and in England, very small numbers. And so the two things are in this very broad, in brute sense, related. You can't have layer upon layer of genocide and ethnic cleansing if you're not starting with incredible diversity. Like, and that's not, I'm not getting to causation, but that's part of the puzzle, so to speak, mathematically. If we're going to ask how could there be so much undoing of diversity in the 20th century, it's partly because there was so much diversity to start out with, and there was so much diversity to start out with because the state building models were different, and the dominant form of the city was different, right? So, you know, in the case of Vilnius, or for that matter, Krakow or Lviv, the city is built by successive invitations of people, right? Successive invitations, and like Vilnius is an extreme case. Oh, you know, you come, we'll build you a church. It'll be nice. You know, you'll love it. Look, it's a Christian church, and that model is different from the purification model, right? I mean, if you want to build an ideal type. And so there's a reason for the diversity, which is the states and the cities are built up, you know, very broadly speaking, along different lines. But your question is about memory, right? And it's a very hard thing because everyone wants to. It's hard not to land on one side of the binary, right? So when people say, oh, you know, you East Europeans, you're so intolerant, then the East Europeans naturally say, well, actually, look, we're so tolerant. You know, look at Vilnius and the Uniats, and look at Vilnius and the Jews, and look at Vilnius and the Muslims. And so it's like you accept the frame of reference, like you're tolerant, no, we're not. You know, you're intolerant, no, we're not. We're actually tolerant if you look further back. And so one gets stuck, I think, in this kind of polemical argument. What I find more interesting is the way in which I think, and then I'm just going to kind of make a different point, that it's the homogeneous form of the state which has already shown its limits, right? So you can build, you know, l'hexagone, you can build La République Française, you know, you can build a model state, and then what does that mean? Well, you lose your empire and you go to Europe, and suddenly you're in a plural political community with multiple levels of authority all over again, right? Suddenly you're in a thing which looks actually somewhat like the Habsburg monarchy, or like the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, or for that matter, the Ottoman Empire. You're suddenly in a thing which isn't just a state and the citizens, right? Like the West European model was, let's just sort this all out, make it really simple. They're just citizens and a state. You know, that's it. It's very simple. The lines go from this individual to the state, you know, but that has hit a dead end. That's over, right? And so the model of toleration, which says we're all in one community together because we've expelled everybody else, and now we're going to be tolerant of ourselves, you know, that model is already obsolete, right? And so one way to ask that question in a slightly different way would be, given that we know that the aim to have a homogeneous nation state which can claim to be tolerant because nobody else is around, given that has reached its end politically, you know, given that the states which were the most successful ones, whether it's Sweden or France, like pick your state, Norway, whatever one you love, it's involved in this much larger project called the European Union because it has to be. And so once you say that, then you could think, okay, well, not that, you know, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania is just like the European Union, but maybe there's something from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania that we can think about that would add some color to this project. Or maybe the Grand Duchy of Lithuania will help us to think about how the European Union must be a historical project, not just a technocratic or a bureaucratic or a rationalizing project, but a historical project like other projects. Maybe it can help us, right? So we don't get caught in this, you're intolerant, you're tolerant, no, you're intolerant, no, you're intolerant.
So this is really thought-provoking, and trying to change that dialectics of thinking about what actually tolerance is and what are the preconditions of it, and on the contrary, what is the soil where unfortunately the atrocities and crime and hatred emerge, and how that's intertwined with predecessing developments. I want to build on what you were saying about the civilizational package of Christianity, and to ask Professor Vaishulete, in fact, about its relationship of this Christian civilizational package in relation to Vilnius, because when I look particularly on your works on the history of Christian Vilnius, I am mostly curious and interested about Christianity of Vilnius being a form of dialogue between different groups of the society. We have partially touched upon that, particularly in the dialogue with Dr. Sapaliauskaitė, but how does Christianity of Vilnius foster the dialogue? Could you elaborate about that in the history and the context of Vilnius?
Thank you. Of course, I also would like to start by thanking for invitation. This really very much thought-provoking, the panels and the keynote speaking, and I believe we're not only summing up some important pieces what was dealt and published and taught about Vilnius and Grand Duchy of Lithuania, but also moving forward. In discussion form, not in academic work, it will translate it probably, but it is really a luxury to be in this world of very different personalities, academic personalities, approaches, schools, and thinking. So talking about Christianity of Vilnius, what Professor Snyder already told, it's really based on north-south and east-west. Vilnius is a particular place where Greek Christianity and Latin Christianity develops parallelly and almost from the same starting point. So it's Kiev and Rus, mostly, yeah, from south, but also from north, from Novgorod and Vitebsk and Polotsk coming into Vilnius through marriages. It's enough to remember two wives of Algirdas, both Orthodox princesses, but also tradesmen and so on, and Latin Christianity. It has its martyrs almost the same time, early Christian martyrs for Lithuania, of course, that parallel existence is also intermingling, and I will try to mention some interesting points. One is, of course, a result of that vicinity, of result of existing in political reality and cultural reality, and what's living abroad, you know, as neighbors. It's not a short political process, it's long political and religious process, is Brest Union, Greek Catholic Union. First real union, Florentine Union, was an attempt, it didn't really work. Even, you know, it kind of fostered theological, ecclesiological approach, but it really is started and made and lives already in national form of Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, but it started in Grand Duchy and in Vilnius. Vilnius was the center and almost the crib of union. And of course, then the Russian Empire and Soviet Union unraveled, but that's one interesting thing. Another very interesting thing is that being neighbors and being rivals at the same time, Orthodox and Latin Christianity, through reform and reformation in Latin Christianity, produces very interesting connections between Reformed Christianity and Orthodoxy. We have Reformation coming into Orthodoxy in Grand Duchy of Lithuania and reaching up to Moscow. Of course, it ends badly there in Muscovite state, but definitely ideas are there. And also from Vilnius, we have an attempt, from Vilnius Orthodox, we have an attempt to reform Patriarchy of Constantinople into Calvinist form. Didn't work either, but it's Vilnius that produces being here around. So talking about dialogues or mutual influences, I'm not talking about religious customs when suddenly in Catholic Lithuania, you have 7 sleeping brothers. When everybody knows if it rains in that, when it begins, it will rain in 7 days or 7 weeks. There's no sleeping brothers in Latin tradition. It's Greek tradition. But it comes already, you know, on the village form. And here it would be possible to mention lots of other issues. On political form, it's also was interesting, you know, when For example, in Vilnius City Council, there was division for Greeks and for Latins. With Reformation, Greeks side with Reformed Latins, with Protestants, and they work together. Well, now if you look, from Muscovite, it's total anathema. Catholics bad enough, but the Reformed Latins is many times worse. It's absolutely no. Now looking into also those trans-confessional influences, for example, Vilnius University, through ununited Orthodoxy, but also through united Orthodoxy, through Greek Catholics, Vilnius University as educational and cultural project reaches Kiev, and from Kiev already in Russian Empire reaches Moscow. Let's not forget that Mikhailo Lomonosov, founder of the Moscow University, was actually formed in Kiev. So we have that very far-reaching and interesting, interconfessional things, and it's maybe, yeah, there were also dialogues in form of disputa, in form of taking different positions. Yeah, so Vilnius, and on one way, talking about Christianity, we only now, and also thanks to Ukraine, when Ukraine starts coming in, we have much more attentive research of religious life also in Vilnius, and that what Pope John Paul II called the second lung of Christianity, and we see that those both lungs were pretty present in Lithuania and in Vilnius.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think, and of course, on the top of that, adding old believers and their also salience, although in the small figures. And
well, no, they were pretty isolated till the very late. Old believers came to Lithuania as refugees and tried to live exactly, they were accepted, they were allowed to be, but they tried not to mix with anybody. And it's only in already late modernity that we have them. It's true. Then they really integrated. It's also very interesting that old believers, partially, even by being, there was strong effort to instrumentalize them, partially by Tsarist Russia, but then really by Soviet Union, that they really integrated into Lithuanian society, and we have old believers between signatories of Second Lithuanian independence and very active people working there.
so in that form, this is also a manifestation of how belonging to the body of Christianity in different forms has contributed to the political history that has been happening in Vilnius. Professor Vyšylaitė, I'd like also to draw on the other field of your scholarly work, not only the history of church, but also on working in the field of cultural heritage that you've been doing. And most specifically, I'd like to ask your opinion. How do you see, through your lens and perspective, the interplay between history of ideas that have been unfolding in Vilnius as a result of these multiple dialogues that we've just described, and the practices of preserving cultural heritage, often produced by the very same communities? So this dialogue between generating ideas, contemplating ideas, and actually producing heritage and caring for heritage. And in this regard, noticeably, heritage is not only tangible, can be also intangible. But what is your take on that, from contemplation to actual work with heritage has been happening in Vilnius? Is there something we can learn?
Well, I teach a course on heritage of Grand Duchy of Lithuania at the history department of Vilnius University. And how I'll start, talking with my students, I say that where is direct heritage of Grand Duchy of Lithuania, where you really can reach it, it's religious communities. It's only one thing that survives without big alternation. And even some cult buildings still are functioning as such uninterruptedly from the Grand Duchy, from the 16th century. Many of them were closed, converted, something, but actually some churches, for example, in Vilnius Dominican Church, cathedral was closed and turned not into garage that it was intended at the beginning, but then into a museum. But many things that coming, at least, to 18th century already to Commonwealth is there. And so that heritage is, first of all, not a heritage, it's tradition. It's like, family continues. That's the one thing. State and other institutions in Lithuania are much worse with looking into that heritage, because idea of separation of state and church, even in Lithuania, it's rather mild, but quite often when it comes about real actions for protection of material or immaterial heritage, suddenly comes in an explosive way. It's scary to think what will happening with incredibly rich heritage of wooden Baroque in Lithuanian countryside of wooden Baroque churches. With now, Vilnius is growing, but countryside is thinning in population and everything, and many parishes coming into almost not existence. It's wood, it's beautiful, mostly 18th century, but very rich interiors. And we know that this building not used, it usually goes on the fire. But for state of Lithuania, it's problem of the Catholic Church. It's not of us as society. That's so talking about, and it's similar in Vilnius. But here I would talk, about religion. On one hand, there is the growing collaboration of religious communities exactly in heritage format. For example, in Days of the Heritage, when religious communities not only open their places, but also tries to present, what they have and different traditions. In society that's secularizing very fast. It's secularized society, but also secularization is going on in Lithuania. And if 15 years ago, teaching the same students and taking them to different buildings of churches, acting of them, usually they were there. Now from 20 people, maybe 2 have been in the church of those that are of the first year. And it's astonishing how fast things are developing. It would be, you go to the Orthodox Church and ask students, have you been here? I doing that long time. No, why? It's different. I mean, they coming from Catholic tradition, and it was, they don't feel comfortable. They afraid that they will cross some lines or something. No, they just haven't been there because it's foreign. And that's another thing, that the heritage as it is does not perceived as part of living tradition. What is very different from Ukraine, even those traditions they are, battling among themselves. So I don't know how much is their answer to that, but and now, now we have issue what is partially of the heritage, a big split in Orthodox community, Orthodox Church in Lithuania. Well, it's true, it was Kievan Orthodoxy until 19th century. Then it became Muscovite. And now it is, split back and part of, not so large, but still, part of community, split from Moscow, and they were expelled over the war in Ukraine. But no, Constantinople Patriarchy re-entered as structure into Lithuania, and not in Vilnius only. We have parish already in Kaunas, and we have in a couple other places in Lithuania. So, and part of it is also heritage. It's been Kiev here and not Moscow. But you know how Moscow coming into it.
I think, Professor, that entrance, let's say, of Constantinople Patriarchate, its return back to Vilnius will somehow help the preservation of Orthodox church heritage in Lithuania, or it wouldn't reach that far?
Well, here I have to mention one interesting thing of the Lithuanian law. In our constitution, looking from the point of attitude to, to religion, we are very much of region, and because we do not consider, regardless of all efforts, especially of United States, some communities, we not consider all religions as equal. There's hierarchy of religious communities. So we have traditional, and it started as this traditional religious churches and communities, state recognized, and then registered. But if you look on that, it's actually thinking of those who wrote Constitution started writing, and actually in 1990, maybe 89, 90, was there are religions that were present in Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and those are traditional. Two Judaic, Karaites and Jews, one Muslim, Tatars, and here they're thinking also about, it was thinking about ethnic communities besides of that. And then we have all richness of Christianity, Orthodoxy, if you think all believers and Orthodox, Catholics, and one of them is Greek Orthodox, Lutherans, Calvinists, Greek Catholics. So all those churches and religions, they were present on territory of Lithuania, but also Grand Duchy, up to the church partition of Commonwealth. Then we have state recognized those that were present on territory of Lithuania in 1918, February 16. So those mostly Protestant, evangelical even, and then everybody else. But everybody else, we even had attitude, that's a French attitude, those probably, and suspicion, very Soviet suspicion, cults. That was overcome, but that remains. And so with this traditional concept of what happens, nobody could, coming from that. Lithuania recognized Sufi Islam as traditional in Lithuania. Guess what? After 9/11 and everything. Now we have already two Muslim communities in Lithuania, Tatars and Arabs who are living in Lithuania, who don't even consider sometimes Tatars real Muslims. But it's constitutional, they are traditional, and they're protected by constitution with lots of privilege. So it's long way going too, but Orthodoxy is traditional, and it's not said Muscovite Orthodoxy, but Orthodoxy is traditional church, traditional religion in Lithuania. And there's no way, constitutional and legal way to discriminate Moscow Orthodoxy. So they are untouchable. And heritage buildings all are in the hands now of the Moscow Orthodoxy. But also, you can do nothing. And there's not big desire, somebody goes on the barrel and talks something on the street, but actually there's not big interest to do that. So just to find place for that much smaller community.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move on and to ask Dr. Brandt a couple of questions, partially on the subjects that have been touched upon here, and more specifically when it comes to the Jewish life and the role of Vilnius in that regard. I know that Dr. Brandt will also have his PowerPoint, because this is what we talked in advance, that it would be good to illustrate certain answers. So I'll try to ask for help to put on the screen. But Dr. Brandt, I have the question that I'd like to ask you first is as follows. Can you please describe the sense of Jewish nationhood that has been present in Vilnius, and the sense of Jewish future that is communicated through those artifacts produced in Vilnius that now are in the possession of YIVO? Here in not far away from here in New York, but originally in Vilna?
Well, the idea of Jewish nationhood, of course, is an old one, but it was revived in an interesting way at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, as nationalism without nationalism, a kind of cultural nationalism, a nationhood without borders as well, a transnational nation. And Vilna was to a great extent a center for the intellectual life of this movement, this way of thinking. It was Shimon Dubnov who wrote that Judaism is not really just a religion. It is a religion, but it is also a culture. It is a historical memory, and it is a language. And the language was Yiddish. And the culture that was essential for the creation of national self-consciousness among the Jews was to a great extent precisely what the YIVO Institute was bent on collecting, preserving, and helping to disseminate. And of course, the story of the YIVO Institute is to a great extent parallel with the story of building a Jewish future that would be precisely this strange kind of nationhood. A nation without an army, a nation without a flag even, but a nation built on self-consciousness, common culture, a language, and a religion. And of course, the Holocaust wiped this out. It wiped out Yiddish. It wiped out the people. But owing to the extraordinary efforts of individuals during the time of the Vilna Ghetto in 1942 and 43, hundreds of thousands of documents, artifacts, books of all kinds, some of which I will show, were preserved. The Nazis stole much, and these materials that the Nazis stole for the purpose of using eventually in Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda were sent to Frankfurt. Their ultimate destination was Frankfurt. They never quite got to Alfred Rosenberg's Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt. They were housed in Offenbach, and there they were found after the war by the US Army, working with the Smithsonian Institution and the Library of Congress. After months and months and months of investigation, these materials were then deemed to have, in fact, most of them originated at the YIVO Institute, and they were sent to New York. But there was another section of these materials that had been hidden in the Vilna Ghetto by what was called the Paper Brigade. And the Paper Brigade was a collection of some 30 individuals who, in defiance of the Nazi orders and at risk literally of being shot on the spot, hid these materials in their clothing, in their shoes, under their arms. There is one story of Shmerke Kaczerginski wrapping a Torah scroll literally around his body and walking to the checkpoint where he was sure the guard would find him and discover what he was doing, and he would be shot, but he did it nonetheless. Unfortunately, there was some disturbance elsewhere. The guard was distracted and he went in. So this was quite an extraordinary operation. And the result of it was these materials, hundreds of thousands of materials, were saved and hidden. After the war, Sutzkever, Avram Sutzkever, whom I think Thomas Venslova mentioned earlier, and Shmerke Kaczerginski returned with others, and they dug these materials up. Many of you undoubtedly have heard of the Ringelblum archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. Well, these also were dug up after the war. They were then put in a museum, the New Jewish Museum of Vilnius. And in 1948, the Soviets gave the order to destroy everything. And it was at that point that the librarian the head of the Lithuanian National Library, or Book Chamber, as it was then called, Antanas Ulpis, decided that he could not allow that to happen at the risk of his life. He saved these materials from the pulping mill. And all of these materials that were hidden were those that would do what? They would give the Jewish people of Eastern Europe, who at the beginning of the 20th century had no public library, had no university in which to study, had no actual knowledge of their own past. It would give them their past. It would give them, by giving them their past, it would give them a future. It would tell them how they got there, how they developed, what their language was. And it was in Vilnius that this happened, precisely because of all of the things that we have heard here today, because of the multicultural nature of the world that Vilnius represented. So may I show some slides now? Okay. This is the YIVO building as it existed in 1935 on Wywulski Street in Warsaw, in Vilnius, excuse me, in Vilnius. Yes, I could be shot for that mistake. I apologize. You see, it's a modern building. It is not meant to look like a Jewish building. It is meant to be a secular modern building because YIVO was devoted precisely to a secular and modern future for the Jewish people. This is what it looked like in 1944 when Avram Sutzkever returned. And here at the bottom is Avram Sutzkever, who returned in July of 1944. And around him, you see all this rubble. And the reason he is here is not just to look at the remains of that building, but because in this rubble are documents and books and the remains of precisely those precious things that he and others had hid. And this is where YIVO was. Now, when I first saw this, that's what I was told. And I thought, well, this building in the background is where YIVO was. And then my guide said, no, you're quite wrong. YIVO is here in this empty place. And that empty place that you see, if you can see, let me try to make it bright. That empty place by the car, the street, is the emptiness that so many Jews around the world carry within themselves about themselves because they do not have access to this history. And they do not have access to this history because these materials have been hidden. These materials were torn apart. Probably a third, at least, of what YIVO had was destroyed either by the Nazis or by the Soviets, but a lot was saved. And so this empty street seemed to me particularly significant because it is precisely that empty street that it is YIVO's feeling that we have an obligation to try to fill with knowledge. This is a picture of Kaczerginski and Sutzkever sorting the books for the Nazis. And this is a picture of the books being taken by lorry to the train station en route to Germany. And this is a picture of all of those books being returned to YIVO by the US Army in 1947. These are the crates, and we have many books at YIVO that bear the stamp of the Einsatzstab Rosenberg on them, and it's quite chilling to see this. But here is Sutzkever and others going from house to house in 1944, collecting the material that was hidden. Here is some of that material, as you see, and here is the church in which Antanas Ulpis hid the material from the Soviets. So this is a wonderful story, and it in many ways parallels much of what we have heard today about the cultural matrix of Vilnius, because these materials were created by Jews, not just in Vilnius, by the way, but from all over the world. I was in Vilnius and we were looking through boxes, and all of a sudden the archivist takes out a poster of a performance of a play, Kuni Lemo, in the Jewish theater in Douglas Park, Chicago. And when I was a boy, my father used to tell me, because I grew up in Chicago, of going to that theater and watching Kuni Lemo. And the idea that Jews in Chicago, you see, were sending their material to Vilnius tells you much about the importance of this project and how deeply the Jewish people all over the world understood this to represent their future. They wouldn't do this just out of idle curiosity. They did it with passion and an ardency that was for them the key to having that future in the world, which was then wiped out. And so by the Nazis and the Soviets, and for me, when I was growing up, it didn't exist either. And I am glad to say that for those young people today, both in Lithuania and in New York and elsewhere in the world, these materials now are available. And in a way, over these last 15 years in which I have been the director of the YIVO Institute, I have been both a witness to the recovery of Jewish memory, and with this recovery of Jewish memory through these documents, and let me show you this one in particular. Here you see the face of a little girl, Beba Epstein. She's 13 years old, and she has what we call chutzpah, because at the age of 13, she writes her memoir. And she submits this memoir to a contest. It was possibly the YIVO contest, or it may have been some other. But in any case, this is one of the items that Antanas Ulpis saved and hid. And we discovered this not in 1991, when the original discovery of materials was made, but in 2017, when a second and even as large a discovery of Jewish materials was made in the National Library of Lithuania in Vilnius. And I asked the Lithuanian authorities, please, to send this to me in New York City, where we put it on display, and we invited the New York Times to come, because we had a little press conference about our project with the Lithuanian library. And the photographer saw this picture and he put it on the front page of the culture section of the New York Times the next day. And I was sitting at my desk, and we all assumed that little Beba Epstein had perished in the Holocaust. But I received a phone call, and the phone call was, Mr. Brent, yes, you are the head of YIVO? I said, yes. Well, I'm the son of Beba Epstein. She had survived, and no one knew. And her son, who is now a lawyer in Los Angeles, had no idea of what was in her memoir either. And so this project has given people back their lives. in a very often micro way, as with the son of Beba Epstein, but in a much larger way, to instill what? To have a future, you have to believe in yourself. And these materials help us do that. It helps young people do that. And so we are very grateful, on the one hand, to be witnessing this flowering, really, of Jewish selfhood as a result of the opening up of these materials, but also to be observing at the same time the evolution of democratic society in Lithuania that has made this possible. And so the two things are working side by side. The more that we do, the more possible it becomes to do more. And so in 2000, just very quickly, in 2014, we began a project with the Lithuanian institutions, the National Library, the Central State Archive, and the Wroblewski Library, to digitize all these materials and reunite them digitally into a single project known as the Vilna Collections. To give you some idea of why these are important, I will just point to this, which is a Yiddish translation of Homer's Odyssey and Iliad. For me, and I think for a vast number of American Jews who were growing up when I did in the post-war era, such a thing would have been incomprehensible. That Jews in the Eastern Europe would have been interested in, of course, this was translated in Germany, but this is translated in Warsaw, Pushkin's Tale of the Dead Princess, that these works are being translated into Yiddish. All of a sudden, when young people come to YIVO and they see these materials, they realize that their culture was a much bigger one, a much deeper one, a much more curious and knowing one than they had ever imagined. This is an algebra book published in Vilna in 1829. In 1829, I thought my ancestors were living in mud huts somewhere in some unknown land. And I believe that that is what most American Jews think about their history if they have an extraction from Eastern Europe or Russia. It has been said that Jews had no connection to nature or to health. And here we see children folk dancing. Here we see children performing calisthenics. Here we see in 1938, let me see if I can get rid of this. There we go. From Poland, hygiene, and this is a hygiene checklist for a student from a school. And this is an astronomical diagram from Vilna in 1835. An astronomical diagram, not a religious treatise, not a Yiddish folk song, but an astronomical diagram. Here are reports about revolutionaries, but here we see them dancing at an Orthodox summer camp. This I particularly love because these are calisthenics at a summer camp for Orthodox boys. You see, they're not entirely comfortable with what they're doing. But this is a summer camp for Zukunft for the Bund. And if you look at these young men and these young women, you see young men and young women who could be gathered on the streets of New Haven or New York City. And so this injects a different way of thinking about oneself if you happen to be Jewish and if you happen to be interested in this history. Of course, we have, maybe I'll close it now. Let's see, there we go. But this is what Evo does. And so, although I believe, coming back to your question about the future, I do not think that there is today a real future for the present Jewish community in Lithuania, only because there are so few. There are some 5,000, maybe, I believe. That's what I think. But what Lithuania today can give the Jewish people of the world helps to give Jews around the world a different sense of what their future can be.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brand. This is not an extremely powerful presentation and those artifacts that you demonstrated, but the conclusion that you brought up, I think it not only makes many of us proud, but even more motivated, us Vilnians, us Lithuanians, those who care about the complexities of the past of Vilnius and one of its core foundations, and namely the Jewish civilization, its presence there, in whatever language, in whatever form it's been manifested and articulated. And therefore, gradually moving across our panel, as we started with Professor Snyder, who unfortunately had to leave us to some unexpected developments. We started with civilizational packages. We moved through faith and Christianity. We talked about the Jewish pillar that encompasses faith, culture, arts. And there is one more aspect that I'd like to touch upon with Dr. Čerškutė, and in particular, the role of literature. Before I do so, I see that Professor Vaisiulaitė wants to add a comment to Dr. Brandt.
Just very brief. I cannot not react to your thought that there's no future for Jewish community in Lithuania. Karaite community, yes, Judaic too, it's 200 people. They think they have future. So 5,000, it's a lot. And knowing Jewish community or members who involved, there's definitely future.
Let us hope. Let us hope.
Dr. Čerškutė, you've been working for years, for decades now, on this subject, on multiple subjects in current Lithuanian literature, the Lithuanian literature of the second half of the 20th century, and some of the most renowned authors. And more importantly, I perhaps wanted to ask you a question. In general, what is the sort of place that Vilnius occupies in contemporary Lithuanian prose, in contemporary Lithuanian literature? And by saying contemporary, perhaps let's look at the second half of 20th century till nowadays. How would you describe that role and purpose that Vilnius fulfills in that realm?
Yes, thank you for the question. And it's quite difficult to speak after Dr. Brandt about literature. Thinking about your question, I think we have to start with a significant historical coincidence because the history of contemporary Lithuanian prose can be dated back to the publication of the novel Vilnius Poker by the Lithuanian writer Ričardas Gavelis. And this novel was published in November 1989, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this novel not only shows one of the most memorable images of Vilnius in contemporary Lithuanian prose, but also for the first time criticizes the totalitarian system, and not only in a metaphorical way, but also in a completely open way. In Vilnius Poker, Gavalis has created a compelling and multi-layered portrait of Vilnius that spans a century of the city's history, from the legend of the city's founding, the dream of Grand Duke of Lithuania Gediminas, to the time of the novel setting, it is 1970s, and the Soviet occupation. Through this line, the legends of the city are revealed, and the city is personified and metaphorized, and finally it becomes one of the most important characters of the novel. And Vilnius, everything depends in Vilnius on Vilnius, and Vilnius Poker is a powerful metaphor of living in Soviet Vilnius. Gavalis' breakthrough as a novelist coincided with the restoration of Lithuanian independence in 1999, March 11. Before that, Gavalis had published only 3 books of short stories. And actually the same happened to another Lithuanian writer, Jurgis Kunčinas. Before Lithuania regained independence, Kunčinas was known as a poet, but after 1990s, when he started publishing novels, he became some kind as a chronicler of Vilnius. And the hero of Kunčinas' first novel, which is called Glisan's Lupin, was published in 1992. So that hero wanders around Vilnius, interested in the city's architecture and topography. And a year later, in 1993, Kunčinas' second novel, Tula, was published, and it's considered by many to be one of the best love stories in Lithuanian literature, but actually it presents quite a vivid picture of Bohemian Vilnius in Soviet times. So Gavalis and Kunčinas, these 2 writers, dominated the field of Lithuanian prose, and until their deaths, sadly, they both died in 2002. And the imagery of Vilnius created by both of them gives the readers, I think, some kind like a 3D picture of Vilnius, because Vilnius of Gavalis is not only a character, but also a demerge of stories. In creating a picture of Vilnius, Gavalis seem to see through all the historical layers of Vilnius, and he has repeatedly said that his inspiration is James Joyce, who intended to capture the Irish spirit, while Gavalis' novels are about capturing or creating the Lithuanian spirit. Kunčinas' Vilnius is different from Gavalis' Vilnius, and it's not constructed like Gavalis, but alive, playful, and quite authentic, because it is full of realistic details. And his depiction of Vilnius can be read as a map of the Soviet Vilnius that no longer exists. So Gavalis and Kunčinas began a new phase, a new, paragraph of urban prose in contemporary Lithuanian prose, and with the memorable depictions of Vilnius in the second half of the 20th century and the search for the core of Vilnius identity. In the new millennium, then Lithuanian prose is going through an essayistic period. It was about 2002. Vilnius becomes just a geographical reference. In general, in the essays, for example, of writers Sigitas Parulskis or Giedra Radvilavičiūtė, the city appears as a space where events take place, where reflections on life's themes arise. And actually the same applies to recent prose works. And Vilnius made a powerful return to Lithuanian prose in 2008. with Kristina Sabaliauskaitės novel Silver Arum. And it's no coincidence that the entire Silver Arum tetralogy, 4 novels, has been called the Great Vilnius Saga. And in telling the story of the Norwegian family, Sabaliauskaitė also tells the story of the life of Vilnius at that time and tells the history of the Vilnius Baroque. All 4 Silver Arum novels are notable for their memorable imagery of Vilnius and the exposure of Baroque values. Vilnius and Sabaliauskaitės work once again becomes like a unique character affecting the lives of others. And I want to mention that Sabaliauskaitės and Gavelis imagery of Vilnius, while they are, different, but is united by the fact that they are both were born in Vilnius. And I'm not saying that only Vilnians should write about Vilnius, but the code of the city, which has been, I don't know, maybe in the blood since the birth, is also reflected in literature, that memory of the city.
Thank you, Rita. I was thinking while you were bringing us to better understanding of those most salient authors of Lithuanian contemporary prose, but Vilnius, I was also thinking about the change in the culture of readership that is happening in Vilnius. You just mentioned that it's not necessary to be Vilnian to write about Vilnius, right? But we see that Vilnians are actually very eager readers these days, right? One of the most remarkable events every year is perhaps the Vilnius book fair, right? That gathers tens of thousands of people, like literally, I mean, the whole neighborhood is blocked essentially by cars at the time when it happens. So my curiosity is, and I'd like to ask you about, what is the demand for books on Vilnius? That you talked about the spike in interest in Vilnius after Kristina Sabaliauskaitės Silver Arum, right? Is there any particular demand that you see for literature on Vilnius that is happening? Maybe Sci-Fi Vilnius, maybe Bildungskommando Vilnius,
No.
anything like that? How is this culture of readership in Vilnius and about Vilnius been changing recently? Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I think it is changing in non-fiction books, but how to say, we have a little bit problems in fiction because we don't have novels like Gavelis, Kunčinas, or Sabaliauskaitė, for example, in the past 10 years. I mean, we do have detective stories, but, it's not a fiction. It's some kind of genre fiction. And it's just, you read it through 2 or 3 hours, and after that, you forget everything. So I don't know. I think the problem is that people forget about, and writers maybe are forgetting about metaphor and that power of metaphor. And what I miss in nowadays prose fiction, that reflection about Vilnius in metaphorical way. I mean, Vilnius, it's only a place where, characters are gathering or going through. And we can see that in, for example, auto-fiction novel of Virginija Kulvinskaitė, Kai aš buvau malalietka. So it's some kind of Bildungsroman, but it's only one example. And I don't know what we have to do. I think maybe, Vilnius, after Lithuania regained the independence, became like normal capital of European cities. So I don't know, maybe people are not inspiring. I'm just guessing, but I really do miss a very powerful and creative reflection about Vilnius in Lithuanian prose fiction. And if we have time, I want to finish my talk with the quote of Gavelis, because I wrote a dissertation on Gavelis, and there's very beautiful fragment about Vilnius. And actually, when Dr. Brandt was talking and was showing that picture of St. George Church, so, in Vilnius Poker, the main character, Vytautas Vargalys, he is survivor of Gulag. And when he came back from Siberia, he started work at the library. And that prototype of a library was that book palace. So it's some kind of connection. So I quote Gavalis. Vilnius is a ghost city, a hallucination city. It's impossible to dream it up or to imagine it. It is itself a dream of a concoction of fantasy. The spirits of the Grand Dukes of Lithuania walk about Vilnius, coast the girls, and grimly shove at the trolleybus steps. Here the smell of the Polish years, the smell of fires and plagues, and the most banal stench of cheap gasoline hover and mingle. Here at night, the iron wolf howls desolately, calling for help. Here you can unexpectedly meet the dead, tortured once upon a time at the Gestapo or the KGB, repeating over and over again the name of their betrayer, which no one wants to hear. In Prague or Lisbon, the past lingers next to today's wholeness. In Vilnius, every building, every narrow little street crossing is simultaneously the scene of ancient life and today's catalepsy. Vilnius is innumerable cities laid one atop another. It isn't just the earth that lays down archaeological layers here, but time and air and language do too. In the same spot, layers of Eastern and Western cultures lie hidden and turn into one another. Vilnius is the border where Russia's expansionism and Europe's spirit went to war. Here, absolutely everything collided and mixed. Vilnius is a giant cocktail stirred together by the insane gods of fog. The end of quote.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very meaningful and powerful note to finish this panel on a quote from Gavalis. Those of you perhaps who were recently in Vilnius, that counts for me at least, in Mo Museum, there is this wonderful exhibition about both Richard S. Gavalis and Vilnius, and this is a very truly immersive experience that you can get through this intertextual approach to finding Vilnius experience. It's so strongly recommended. It produced quite an impression on me, at least. Last week I checked it out and strongly encourage you to do so if you are nearby Vilnius. We have time. If there is any of those that you'd like to ask, I suggest the following. As you know, there is a music recital coming in roughly half an hour from now with Andrius Labys and also with Haven Quartet. It's not happening in this venue. It will take us a couple of minutes walking to the Harkness Hall. That's a beautiful venue where the concert will take place. And there is an intrinsic link that I learned here at Yale while being a student between thinking and walking. So I encourage us all while walking to think strongly about what we have heard, but also to share our thoughts, deliberations with the panelists.